I will now go to introduce today's topic. This is the first season, as we say, and today is the episode 1, where we will be looking at the African peer review mechanism. And the question, or the global question, is can it still drive democratic governance in Africa? Right. So I think before even we invite our speaker of today, I just want to introduce a little bit about what is African peer review mechanism. The African peer review mechanism was adopted by the African head of state in July 2002 as a systematic process of self-assessment, peer learning, and mutual accountability. It was designed as a uniquely African instrument to strengthen governance across the continent by encouraging countries to examine themselves openly and honestly. The mandate of APRM, as it's known, was to ensure that the policies and practices of participating member countries or member states, it aligned with the political, economic, and corporate governance values, code, and standard as set out by the African Union Declaration on Democracy, on Political, Economic, and Corporate Governance. So through the country's reviews, because every country, they do reviews every day, through the country's reviews, peer dialogue, and periodic reporting, the APRM aims to promote transparency, reduce governance vulnerabilities, and foster culture where African countries can learn from one another while supporting continuous institutional improvement. So that is really a quick background of African peer review mechanism. It will now be my honor to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Ambassador Mohau Pheko. It's really my pleasure to introduce her as the guest speaker for this inaugural session of the Geopolitics Series. Dr. Ambassador Mohau Pheko is a former ambassador to Japan, a seasoned diplomat, governance expert, strategist, academic, a long-standing activist for women empowerment and Africa's development. She brings decades of insight into the continental governance, into women empowerment and development of this continent, including the foreign policies, but also her role as South Africa was going through the multilateral systems. So we are honored to have you, Ambassador Pheko. And now, let me just start already with the first question. As I was alluding to the role of APRM today, Ambassador, in your view, is the Africa peer review mechanism still relevant in the Africa's current governance and political reality? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for hosting this and for inviting me to this inaugural conversation, which is very important. My title is fine as ambassador. As I become doctor in artificial intelligence next year, you will add the additional accolade. But thank you also for setting the tone and the background for the African peer review mechanism. And indeed, with everything that is happening on the African continent now, it's important for us to reflect on some of our institutions, particularly the the Africa peer review mechanism, in light of the coup d'etats, in light of the wars in Sudan, for example, we need to look at that. Is it still an instrument that is relevant for the African continent? My answer for that is yes and no. And I think we need to speak quite plainly. The Africa peer review mechanism has become a diplomatic zombie. It's very elegant in theory, but it's putrefying in practice. Yes, it was launched in 2003 with a lot of fanfare, everybody talking about African solutions for African problems. But the Africa peer review mechanism, which promised mutual accountability among peers, 2 decades later, as presidents delete term limits like spam emails, as electoral commissions become ruling party subsidiaries, and as constitutional coups proliferate across the continent, we must ask the uncomfortable question. Has the APRM become little more than an elaborate performance of governance while the house burns? The answer is brutally simple. The Africa peer review mechanism is relevant now only as a case study in institutional failure.
So I think this is actually very, very interesting. So I think you have a lot to say, even just by you saying that, it has become a diplomatic zombie. That is actually a very, very interesting to see that. And and you were just saying it's already 2 decades. And what I would say, despite the existence of the governance framework, like it does have, but we can see, you just mentioned Sudan now. We can see that Africa continued to witness diplomatic backsliding. Okay. So why is this happening? Because yes, you say yes and no, right? So yes, there's still some relevance into that, right? And now my question is, why are we still witnessing this?
I think that part of the problem is with the mechanism itself. Number one, it's a voluntary instrument for self-monitoring by African governments. In other words, when something is volunteer, it is not going to receive the amount of pressure that it deserves. I mean, member states agree to periodic reviews of their governance and democracy. They have to agree to this. They agree to have their political systems looked at. They agree to have their economic management and socio-economic development looked at. Think of it as a continental report card where African leaders grade each other's homework. Now, from the outset, that is already quite problematic. It's problematic in the sense that there is no government that wants scrutiny, proper scrutiny, and an honest scrutiny in terms of how they govern and how they rule. African states would have the passion and the desire to show what they are doing and want to show their best foot, but they do not want anybody to identify their weaknesses and show that the systems that they have created are actually very weak. Now, to be fair, It has produced some tangible outcomes. And before I elaborate on why it has failed, let us first look at some of the tangible outcomes that have come out of the Africa peer review mechanisms. So far, 42 member states have voluntarily acceded to the mechanism, signaling at least rhetorical commitment to peer accountability. There have been some comprehensive country reviews that have been conducted in 20 plus countries, producing detailed diagnosis of governance challenges. That's good. There are national dialogue platforms that have been created in several countries that bring together government, civil society, and the private sector. There have been policy reforms in countries like Rwanda, Ghana, and Kenya, which have been cited by the APRM, um, and recommend as and they have taken up some of the recommendations and have stated that some of these recommendations have been great catalysts for them to create new reforms. There has been some visibility for civil society. The APRM processes have provided space for citizen voices in governance conversations. There has been regional learning, which I think is very important. The mechanism has documented governance innovations, failures across different regions on the African continent. But Madeleine, here's the painful truth. These achievements pale against the background of Africa's democratic regression. The Africa peer review mechanism has perfected the art of diagnosing while remaining impotent at treatment. It has produced thousands of pages documenting problems that everybody already knows exist, while lacking any mechanism to compel action on its recommendation. Let's look at what has happened just 2003 to 2024. The Africa peer review mechanism conducted reviews in countries that subsequently experienced constitutional term limit manipulations. We've seen this in Burundi. We've seen this in Rwanda. We've seen this in Congo, Brazzaville. That we also contested elections and violence. We've seen this in Kenya. We've seen this in Zimbabwe repeatedly. We're seeing it, we've just seen it now in Cameroon. There's been democratic backsliding. We're seeing it in Tanzania now and Uganda. Military coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Sudan, in Burkina Faso. So the Africa peer review mechanism, it documents risks in many of these contexts. It issues warnings, it makes recommendations, and then it watches. It's powerless as its predictions materialize. This is the fundamental crisis. So you document, you recommend, you predict, but you do absolutely nothing about these predictions. So the Africa peer review mechanism has become the Cassandra of African governance, accurate in prophecy, ignored in practice.
Oh, wow. I don't know where to start. But I think the problem could be what you alluded the first time. This is a voluntary
Yeah.
instrument. I think the problem, the main problem, could be there. And I think my question then would be, I mean, if this is voluntary, it means, okay, like you say, they're coming up with diagnosis and, predictions and so on, but then they don't have the power to enforce basically the implementation. So it's like every good policy that we have in Africa, that is collecting dust somewhere in so many cupboards in Africa. So what would you then recommend? Why even spend resources to maintain such a platform if it has no power to enforce the implementation of the diagnosis?
I think we need to reimagine the Africa peer
Mm,
review mechanism, and I think this is what it would require, Madelein. Um, First, I think you need very strong citizen-triggered reviews. And this would strip governments of the review monopoly because right now the governments have the monopoly on the review itself. And we need to create mechanisms where citizens, civil society, the diaspora communities can directly trigger a review investigation into electoral fraud. In other words, we shouldn't wait for a review to happen in another 5 years in order for an investigation to occur. We need to have a trigger mechanism where we already see that there are risk factors that need to be looked at and the investigation teams go out immediately. Citizens need to be able to trigger that. You see a constitutional violation, you see
mm,
governance failures in terms of even service delivery, for example. But we need to make the mechanism answerable to the governed, not the governors. This is important. And I also
mm,
think that we need binding consequences. We need to, for example, link the Africa peer review mechanism findings to concrete consequences. There must be consequences where things go wrong. Suspension from the African Union organs in a very serious manner, target sanctions on the ruling elite, asset freezes, travel bans. If the world can do this to us, why aren't we able to do this amongst ourselves? A peer review without penalty is peer theater. If we lack
mm,
the courage for enforcement, let's stop pretending we have an accountability mechanism. Also, gender mainstreaming as a governance disruption would also be critical. Women in public office aren't just a diversity metric, they're a governance intervention. So, research consistently shows that women legislators prioritize transparency, education, and health over military spending and patronage networks. A reimagined Africa peer review mechanism should mandate gender parity in all review panels and make women's political participation a core governance indicator with teeth. Where women are systematically excluded from power, democracy is already dead. And I'm not saying that all women are progressive, by the way. We've seen this, the case in point right now in Tanzania. We also need real-time monitoring, no periodic rituals. We need to replace this 5-year review cycle with continuous monitoring using technology, using civil society partnerships and diaspora networks. By the time the Africa peer review mechanism produces a report, 3 coups and 2 constitutional amendments have already occurred. We need a mechanism that responds to crisis in weeks, not years. The financial independence is also quite a critical factor. The Africa peer review mechanism's current funding model makes it dependent on the very governments it should scrutinize. We need to establish an independent endowment funded by bonds, progressive African philanthropy, and conditional international partnerships that cannot be held hostage by authoritarian regimes. Finally, I think that we need to discuss whether we're going to have courage or allow this instrument to become irrelevant. The choice before the Africa peer review mechanism is binary: radical transformation or graceful euthanasia. Africa doesn't need another talk shop producing unread reports while democracy dies in real time. We need an accountability mechanism willing to name names, impose costs, and stand with citizens against their governments when necessary. Of course, this will be uncomfortable. It will strain diplomatic niceties. Leaders will rage about neocolonialism and sovereignty. But the current alternative, watching the Africa peer review mechanism issue polite recommendations while authoritarianism metastasizes, is not neutrality, it's complicity. The question isn't whether the Africa peer review mechanism still drives democratic governance. The question is whether we have the political courage to let it try. The emperor has no clothes. It's time we stop pretending otherwise.
Wow, time we start really pretending. And you've touched on so many, and I can see so many comments in the chat. Please continue to really head your comments and so on. I saw one hand, and I will give you, Dr. Edna, I will give you a minute now to just comment. I think these are very, very important what you've mentioned, the constitutional violation and all that. And we really, a peer review without penalties, like theater, like you say, I totally, totally agree with that. But also the role of women, we're going to come into that a bit later, the financial independence and so on. And just not wait for 5 years. I like what you said. In 5 years, things could have happened, coups and constitutional change. And by the time you do the reporting, you don't know what events to report. So this is definitely not accurate. Thank you so, so much. Dr. Edna, come in. Yeah, chip in there.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Pheko. That was an excellent analysis of the reality on the ground when it comes to our organization, the African organization, and the role of women. I will quote the example of my country, the Republic of Somaliland. I was foreign minister many years ago, and 20 years ago, the African Union, the Organization of African Unity at that time, visited my country, Somaliland, for an evaluation. The evaluation that the organization made was never read, was never reacted on, and never resulted in anything other than spending money to fund the visit and the evaluation of 1 week. My country, Somaliland, by the way, is a country that gained independence on 26th of June, 1960. That was 42 at a time when 42 African countries now sitting in the African Union were still under colonial rule. But then, after a voluntary union with our neighbors in Somalia, former Italian Somalia, and our inability to continue that union, and we withdraw from that union, we have been punished, not only by the African Union, but by the entire world, which refuses to recognize that Somaliland did not unite with Somalia, it was Somalia that united with an already independent Somaliland, that the union did not work, the same way it did not work between Gambia and Senegal, between Egypt and Syria and others, and that we are being punished and being made to be defended and to be represented by the country, a junior partner who claims illegal, fraudulent ownership of my country, Somaliland. And had there been an active African Union, a democratic African Union, an African Union that says, as Professor Pheko said, the king has no clothes, Somalia has no right over Somaliland, this problem could have been resolved in a diplomatic way, in a legal way, and two African countries would have found a way to live together peacefully as neighbors, like Senegal and Gambia have done. So there is a need for reform. There is a need for the presence of women. There is a need for democracy to prevail in the actions that are taken by the African Union. Otherwise, it's a giant, monumental organization, institution that is consuming resources without actually producing any benefit and results from it. So thank you for this chance, and I'd be very happy to continue this conversation, but I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edna from Somaliland. And again, really, the fact that now, we are fighting over land and, the Africa being divided into small pieces, that was also intentional from our colonial masters, but that is not the topic for today. But thank you for just recommending and agreeing that the instruments, the Africa's peer review mechanism need a reform. So thank you so much for that. Right. Back to Ambassador Mohau. We're still talking about the AU and all that. Let's dive into the accountability of the AU. And what do you think? Considering they do have, this instrument, which according to you, it's almost toothless. What structural or political barriers is preventing the AU from enforcing real accountability? Because after all, the African peer review mechanism, they will produce the report. They will put it on a table of AU. It's now isn't up to, according to your understanding, I think we are learning, isn't up to AU to now ensure that these are the recommendations, the predictions, they can then reinforce them into the member countries or the member states to implement them. So what is stopping them from doing that?
I think that in the initial stages, you remember that the APRM came out of NEPAD, and there was a lot of good faith. People were talking about the African Renaissance. Things were going to change. We were going to do things differently. But I think that in the midst and in the blur of all of that, we did not realize that the Africa peer review mechanism is not a mechanism in as much as we call it that. It's really a fig leaf in practice when you look at what is happening at the African Union. One could call it a diplomatic spa where autocrats get their governance sins gently scrubbed by peers who share the same sins. It is actively irrelevant to the street vendor facing police extortion, the journalist in jail, the opposition candidate barred from a ballot, while democracy is mugged in broad daylight. The Africa peer review mechanism writes, as we have said repeatedly, polite reports suggesting better lighting for the crime scene. Its voluntarism is a joke. Everyone in power understands. No enforcement, no consequence, no threat. So if there's no threat to it, it is easy to be tabled at the African Union. Frameworks like the Africa peer review mechanism fail because they are designed to fail. They are pressure release valves, not pressure applicators. We need something that will apply pressure. The African Union's barrier isn't procedure. The procedure is tabling it before the heads of state at the summit, and everybody congratulates the other, one another on how well they're doing. It's collusion. It's a club of incumbents. Who can never institutionalize their own overthrow. Can never. These are all incumbents who want to stay in power. So peer review becomes a code for mutual protection, When a president rewrites the constitution, his peers see a reflection of their own ambitions. If somebody in Burundi can do it, so can we also do it in Cameroon, etc., etc. So this becomes the standard of how we act as heads of state. And when they enforce sovereignty. Now, remember that from the OAU even to the African Union, the whole issue of non-interference in other people's business, in other states, really holds a barrier to anything. People can die, people can be shot across your border, but you can't say it as a neighboring member state because you're not allowed to interfere in the affairs of another state. And this is something that in the 21st century we need to desperately relook at. Remember after the Tanzanian elections just now, young civil society, Generation Z, young people wanted to cross the border to go to Tanzania, from Kenya, to help their counterparts in that country resist and dissent against the electoral process there. Now, that they are defying the whole notion of what non-interference in the affairs of others means. This is something that we must look at. We can't continue to enforce sovereignty because it doesn't give us standards, because today's critic could be tomorrow's defendant. So there is a serious, I think, problem where we need a new toolbox that is sharper, that is simpler, and it's unavoidable. We have to stop strengthening the Africa peer review mechanism. We have to hijack it. Simple. We have to hijack it. Replace its genteel processes with ruthless automatic triggers that even the most cynical regime must factor in. When the Africa peer review mechanism says we are coming to review your country, that government must shiver, not this picnic that we are having now. Let me just stop there for just a minute.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, we need to hijack it, eh? But I wonder, you talking about the hijacking. Uh, the Gen Z, I think they're the ones who have the power to do that, eh? Because it feels like the older generation, they're so comfortable in their, it's like a business as usual, So it feels like that, how can we invest in Gen Z? Because that is really where the heart, and we need to remember, the youth represent over 70% of the African population, so if I think we could invest in them. And for me, really, my follow-on question, I know there are comments in the chat. I will get to the comment in the chat, but just a follow-on question on the Gen Z, where we are feeling that they feel disconnected, they feel so abandoned, they feel like orphans, they have to defend by themselves because no one is defending them. What tools then can the Gen Z be equipped with so they can be more constructive and they can have the results that Africa need? Actually, what do you think need to be provided to them?
When we were growing up as young activists, one of the things that was very critical was the whole issue of national consciousness about what it was that we were fighting for. what it is that we wanted, what kind of world we wanted. Of course, the issues were much different because, we had a colonial apartheid situation. But we need to have them flip the script. And I think a lot of them are beginning to flip the script and really refocusing on not only just neo-colonialism, but also questioning, interrogating, and challenging the governance models and the governance systems that we have put in place as Africans. So for me, one, consciousness, national consciousness is very, very important. There is a lot that there's a lot of things that draw attention to Gen Z that I think sometimes makes it easy for them to have soft, what they call soft life. But I think that with respect, there, and I've seen this on university campuses, I've seen them come together. Even let's just give credit to things like These Must Fall, for example. There's a consciousness that my life has to be better. But we need more conversations, number one, about consciousness. Secondly, those of us, honestly, who have had our turn at the wheel, please, can we just give up the driver's license and give the driver's license to Gen Z? Give them the opportunity to make their own mistakes. Create space for them. We have too many old people sitting in chairs that they should no longer really be sitting through. There's a role. There is a role behind the scene. There is a role as mentors, but it's critical that we allow them to have the space to dream, to think about the kinds of policies that they want, to think about a reimagined Africa. They can't do this when old men and old women sit in these chairs and block and really block the level of innovation and intelligence and brilliance that we see amongst Generation Z. I'm biased because I have Generation Z children, and I see the brilliance when you give them space to think, space to recreate, space to even challenge the way that we think. And I think this is very important. So for me, consciousness and space, those are just those are non-negotiables. We have to give them space and allow them to build the level of consciousness that they need. Sorry to be so long.
I think definitely consciousness, and if I could just add African consciousness, is definitely needed.
Absolutely.
For those young people. Yeah, no, great. Just another follow-on question before I go to the chat and read a few comments there. The issue of non-interference, that policy, I mean, if we're talking about accountability and we belong to one body, which is the African Union, where does the non-interference policy comes in? Because we need to be our brothers' keepers, and we need to correct one another. And yeah, I really don't know. What do you think, and how can we kind of influence and push the AU to actually remove that policy, because it's definitely not something that we need as a continent. Any thoughts on that?
I think that there have been attempts, of course, by many in civil society, and funny enough, even President Kaunda, in his later years, advocated. I think once you're out of power and you begin to see what is happening, you sort of begin to think, maybe we should do things a little bit differently. I think that there are new instruments rather than go for it directly. I think that we have to create mechanisms around it. One of the ways that I've been thinking about it is perhaps creating a financial guillotine. By this, I mean that we integrate the Africa peer review mechanism compliance directly into the African continental free trade area. By this, I mean that full compliance means that we grant preferential trade terms. And non-compliant rating triggers automatic incremental tariffs. You hit them in the treasury. You link it to the African Development Bank. No clean review, no cheap loans. Make good governance a balance sheet imperative. So you begin to use these new instruments that have now come into play within the African continent to begin to take away those privileges for those countries who are non-compliant, and begin to pressurize them that way. And in a way, it's interference, but in a very indirect way, using your trade instruments, your tariff structures, your bank loans from the Africa Development Bank, which just says that if you don't have a clean review, we're not going to give you cheap loans. Your loans are going to be more expensive, and this is critical. I also think that even around we need to set up an electoral fire alarm, create an Africa peer review mechanism, a rapid deployment tribunal for electoral crisis. No observers, no judges. Get judges to and pre-authorize them to enter any member state during an election period. Because observers are like, they're like tourists, electoral tourists who are there, take pictures of what is happening, maybe see somebody stuffing ballots here and there, but it wasn't too bad. It was not as bad as the previous election, so we let it slide. But if you have judges, retired judges, who are pre-authorized to enter any member state during an election period, if there's constitutional manipulation or electoral theft is verified, their finding automatically, one, freezes the offenders' voting rights in the African Union, suspends their access to all African Union peace and security funds, triggers personal targeted sanctions, travel bans, asset freezes on the Electoral Commission chair and the Attorney General. Name and shame the mechanics. So not just the master. So as I'm saying that you cannot trigger a direct non-interference. But if you use some of these instruments, your financial instruments, your electoral instruments, where you send judges in, not just observers, you are already beginning to insert an interference in those countries.
Quite interesting. I just have two more questions at the end. Yeah, this is so good. And I will just look at, the electoral crisis, which you just mentioned now, so the election observers and all that being tourists and so on. But let me just check in the group, in the chats, and just hear what others are saying. Tim Morris, no, sorry, Morris Taebwa. Actually, the whole concept of diplomacy is a problem. I can assure you, you will never hear candid conversation amongst diplomats that we are hearing, that what we are hearing from Ambassador Pheko. They all want to be nice to each other. As people die, states collapse. So there is one comment. Maybe you will have something to say there as well. Next one, again, he continues and say, we need to create critical mass of radical diplomats, those who speak truth to power. Although it's the same power, they are supposed to confront that grants them diplomatic power. So it is basically confronting the hand that feeds you. Mabato says, this is a core problem, lack of accountability, because there's no consequences. Juliet says that the other challenge is the fact that such reports are not shared with civil society. And I think you also mentioned that the activities of civil society, the implication of civil society. That's how the system wants what APRM to be. It is there. Any AU mechanism, is there any AU mechanism that actually has power? That is a question. There's mechanisms are needed to perpetuate the same governance issues that they're supposed to challenge. Exactly. We can't assume that women working within the same patriarchal systems can be any different from the bad men. They just become bad women. Toko says AU is really disappointing us in not stamping its authority. Renee says the mines in Africa, especially South Africa, is not owned by Africans. Only 39% of SA is owned by South Africa. Rare minerals are leaving Africa and our people remain poor. Do we have political strength to stand together and empower our people, especially women? Is there a political will to bring change? At the mining summit in November, we were told we will not even be ready by 2040. What a sad statement. Financial inclusion for women is needed. Non-interference sounds an overall approach to abusive relationship. Non-interference is a blank check to sit tight, autocrats who trust their peers. Give it a intergenerational face to give it a seemingly effective impact. Right, even with recent shutdown campaign, Gen Z were at forefront. Then Datonga said, self-identification and recognition of who we are first. The Gen Z are questioning who we are, and they are not having half response. They are the power now for change. Right. Okay, Mora is saying where are we? Where we are is not a challenge, but we can do at where we are is a challenge. Okay, so maybe Moro yourself, you can clarify that. If you educate an African woman, you educate a continent. But you educate a man, you educate a division of nations. All right. Our judicial system has been compromised. That is Renee, through corruption. So low confidence. However, once we can improve, I agree that we should put mechanism to empower Africa. Right, let's stop there first. Any comment on all this comment, Ambassador Mohau?
Everybody, I mean, is absolutely spot on. And we ourselves have to move from just diagnosing and begin to find ways to build coalitions that can trigger action. In its current form, we all agree that the Africa peer review mechanism is really an accomplice. It provides the paperwork of legitimacy, while tyranny does its work. We don't need to review it. We need to raid it. We need to take its shell, its mandate, its continental reach, and fill it with live ammunition of what we want: financial triggers, automatic sanctions, and direct citizen artillery. In implementing this, we don't need permission as citizens, but by building a coalition of the willing progressive states, Pan-African capitals, and mobilized citizens can begin to effect change. We see this, and we need to give Gen Z the tools and the space to be able to lead some of these coalitions. Let the regimes clinging to the old fig leaf wither in the spotlight by withholding funds, and build public contempt for third termism, for electoral fraud. We need to start building public contempt for these sorts of action. The alternative is no longer irrelevance. It's betrayal. If we don't do something about this, it's betrayal. So we weaponize the court or bury it forever. This is something that we need to do. This polite ghost called the Africa peer review mechanism, we need a new architecture, a new radical rebirth for it that can really hold governments accountable. Just before that, it's important for us also to note that we have national, we have regional, we have continental. A lot of this work needs to start at home at the national level in our own countries in order to build a broad-based coalition regionally and continentally that can build public contempt against reviews that treat leaders like they're at the spa.
Ambassador Modise she says, could the whole concept of peer reviewing in this manner be something not in the African culture? It is a question. Who knows?
Look, I think that when you look at families, for example, my parents' generation, if there was a problem in the marriage, they would go to their elders. Is that non-interference? No, I don't think that's non-interference. They would then interfere in those affairs. But we are also, I think, moving away from a lot of who we are. Somebody talked about identity. We move away from who we are and become afraid of customs and very good cultures that exist that police, for lack of a better word, police our society to be better. And when we lose that sense of self, that sense of who we are, perhaps then we slide into this move towards modernization that, we must be like Europe, we must be like the West. But if you look at the European Union and how they deal with member states who are non-compliant, why can't we follow those mechanisms if then our own mechanisms are not sufficient? But I think that within our cultures, within African, I don't want to say within cultures because African culture is so diverse and amazing. But I think that within our own societies, there are ways that we are able to deal with dissent in families, If we look at the old chief structure, it'd be interesting to look at, in fact, Botswana as a case in point, to look at how they review and how they deal with one another when there is conflict or dissent amongst them. So I think that there are mechanisms. We need to dig a bit deeper into them and find ourselves, find self, find the African self somewhere.
Indeed, I'm sure there are mechanisms. Yeah, we cannot let you go without touching very, very important, important question that I had was actually, and I think you mentioned it about earlier on, the electoral crisis, constitutional manipulations. We are seeing it in Cameroon. How on earth a 92-year-old man should win the elections? We are seeing constitutional manipulations. We've seen it also in Cote d'Ivoire. A third term. All of a sudden, so many African countries, third term and all that. And how is it possible? The same document, declaration of the AU that say this is, we accept the democracy and all that. However, the very same people are not aligning themselves to democratic principles, and they are even endorsing the outcome of those elections. How is that possible? What in your opinion, really, what can we do? Because this cannot continue, really. Your opinion on that?
We need a new architecture. We absolutely need a new architecture. I mean, Madeleine, look at Tanzania. An Africa peer review mechanism was done 2022 to 2023. They conducted a review of Tanzania, culminating in a report, I think, in 2023. The process ran parallel to and failed to meaningfully address the severely repressive political environment solidified first under, respectfully, President John Magufuli, and continued under President Samia Suluhu Hassan. This included the brutal crackdown on opposition in 2020 elections with arrests, killings, and internet shutdowns. The effective banning of the main opposition party, Chadema, in 2023 through legalistic maneuvers, deregistration of its cells. What I'm saying is that the Africa peer review mechanism noted all of these issues. And rather than use this as a prediction to trigger an intervention in Tanzania, for example, it merely became a report. Now we are reading the newspaper, people getting killed, shutdowns against the opposition. So I'm saying that in as much as these reports tell us what is happening, if there's no mechanism of intervention, and if there is no quick trigger to begin to highlight these issues and problems, the Africa peer review mechanism is dead on arrival. I mean, the persistent laws restricting civic space, and we see this across all of our countries. It's encroaching. We have Communications Acts and Media Services Act that are beginning to emerge in many of our countries to shut down the media, to shut down honest reporting, to shut down what you can communicate on WhatsApp, on Facebook, on Instagram, etc. The APRM picks these issues up and they report on them, but it's largely diplomatic and nothing. There's no urgent tool that where the public can hold these governments accountable. So I'm saying that they predict all of these. They predicted everything that is happening that we see now in Tanzania. Here we are today. That instrument is absolutely useful when you have to bury people 6 feet under for no reason at all. For no reason at all. So we have to rebuild. We have not even rebuilt. We need a new architecture of how we peer our governments. I think this is important. But also, in having said that as well, it's not only just governments that need to be peered, civil society as well. We need to peer. We need to be able to peer our own actions, our own advocacy, to test how strong is it, how colluded are we in the actions of our own governments, and not just accuse governments of being evil, but we also participate and enable these governments to a large extent to act in the way that they do. The African peer review mechanism just comes to, endorse and let us know that, hey, this is what is happening. But what use is that when rubber bullets and real bullets are killing innocent lives who are just dissenting against the violation of their human rights? This is just not. We need a new architecture.
Sure, we need a new architecture. Before we let you go, let me just check the final comments in the chat. Just 1 second. I fully agree. This is Maleshwane. I fully agree with Ambassador Pheko that we need to reflect on our consciousness, reflect to who we are. We cannot continue to live in poverty while majority of our minerals, okay, are exported raw material. I cannot agree more with Morris that we need to create a radical diplomat. I believe, this is Juliet, I believe that we should bring women ministers and parliamentarians into such discussion. Well, please invite them. We're going to meet again next week, Friday. Invite them. We are really pushing to have more and more of them here. All right. Datonga said we should create an African women parliament. What do we think about that, ladies? Then Moro said, I support the creation of women parliament and African Women Union. I also support African Women's Bank. There's quite a lot of, I must say, there's quite a lot of women's bank now. Women are waking up across the continent to support the livelihood of African women who are the majority in poverty. Mabato says, what is happening in Tanzania tell us that women are not homogeneous groups and they also must be called out. Renee said, as an activist many years ago, we were radical. We enforced change. I think lots of Gen Z or Gen X actually have become talk show. We need to empower the Gen Zs. And lastly, the images of corpse from Tanzania under the rule of a woman is not only shocking, but calls for those sanctions, repercussion for those dictators. So that's where I think we will end today. It has been really, really great to hear from you. Ambassador Pheko, I would really like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, for depth, insight, and really just helping us reflect critically on the governance of the continent.